sanctions will a local authority have to deal with a developer in this way and take into account those failures when a future planning permission is put in for?
I'm grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee and for the reports that have fed into many of the changes that we have made. And he is right to raise the issues that he has. I think one of the issues that we see far too often, the reason why communities are sometimes opposed to development, is that they don't actually get what was promised at the beginning. And I am really keen that through this bill we give that power back to local communities and that we make sure that the neighbourhood plans are strengthened as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. York is being overrun by investors hoovering up our new build, either leaving those properties empty or using them for Airbnb, which is causing the market to heat up and having a really disruptive impact, of course, choking off opportunity for future buyers in my constituency. So how will he use his planning reforms to ensure that we're not just building to numbers, but actually building to local need?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady, again, is right. I mean, it is empowering local communities to develop local plans and engage with the development of those local plans to identify the housing needs of each area. And she is right to raise the issue around second homes and Airbnb. As I said to her the other day in the meeting that we had, I'm looking forward to potentially hosting a roundtable with her and other colleagues around North Yorkshire to address these very issues.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just on the point that the Minister was just making about perhaps developers or planners going back on previous agreement or advice, I have a case in South Leamington where it was consulted on 6 years ago. We would have social and truly affordable housing being built on a particular site. As of last week, that has now been changed, and we're going to have 80 units with 92 beds in this more or less the same space. So will you, first of all, agree to meet with me to discuss, and can he explain now just how the planning changes will ensure that communities get what they want, which is really, truly affordable housing?
Minister.
Of course, I'd be happy to meet with the honourable gentleman to discuss the issues that he has raised. The whole point of the bill is to strengthen the development of local plans in the first place, so that actually council, local planning authorities can address the housing needs that they have in their area, including the types of housing that they need, and to strengthen enforcement issues around planning applications too. But I would be more than happy to speak to him further to understand the issue in greater detail.
Helen Morgan.
Number 5, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Levelling Up Fund announced at the last spending review saw £1.7 billion awarded to 105 successful projects across the UK, including projects to improve access to employment for those without car access in rural areas.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you. Market Drayton in my constituency, and indeed a number of other towns in North Shropshire, are seeing cuts to their only bus services, and Market Drayton is set to lose it altogether at weekends. It's received nothing from the funding that it's applied for to date, including the Bus Back Better Fund. So like many other towns across Britain, its beautiful High Street is struggling to recover from the pandemic. I'd like to know, for towns like this, which have been unsuccessful in bids so far, where people are struggling to get in and out of them, what is the government's plan to level them up?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd say to the Honourable Lady that she needs to work with her local transport authority, that would be Shropshire County Council, to look into resolving these issues. We know that the pandemic had a huge impact on delivery of local services, and government provided nearly £1.86 billion in grant funding for bus services in England, and Shropshire Council received about £2.17 million of that. So I would encourage her to speak to them and see what they can do along with commercial bus operators.
Peter Alders.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our Levelling Up White Paper sets out our plans to support economic growth across the whole of the UK. Since September 2020, we've allocated over £7 billion of funding through our Levelling Up funds, including the recently announced allocation for the Shared Prosperity Fund.
Peter Alders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that answer. Coastal communities such as Lowestoft and Waveney are the forgotten powerhouse of the UK economy. Can my honourable friend confirm that the opportunities and challenges that they face will be given the highest priority as the government set about delivering their levelling up agenda, and also that the money from the Crown estate that was originally used for the Coastal Communities Fund will be targeted at realising the full potential and meeting the needs of coastal areas?
Minister.
I've met with my honourable friend several times about this, and I agree with him that coastal communities have the potential to be real powerhouses for our economy. It's why the Future High Streets Fund has allocated $149 million to coastal local authorities, and coastal local authorities got $287 million of funding in the first round of the Levelling Up Fund, and that comes on top of the $229 million that you mentioned that we've invested in coastal towns and communities since 2012 through the Coastal Communities Fund.
We now come to Shadow Secretary of State, Lisa Lamb.
I mean, look, can't you see the crisis unfolding across this country? The biggest fall in living standards since the 1950s, pensioners boarding buses just to keep warm. On every measure, the gap is widening, less for the regions in public spending, salaries falling, homes less affordable, local economies on the verge of collapse. Surely he recognises how absurd it is that so far all we've had from the Secretary of State in the last week is the promise of an alfresco dining revolution and 3 full pages of legislation giving us the power to rename our mayors. What exactly is stopping this government from scrapping business rates, bringing in a windfall tax to cut money off energy bills, up-rating benefits now, not waiting till later, or any of the things that will get money back into people's pockets and get our economy growing?
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady could also have mentioned the fact that our national living wage, which this government introduced, is putting £1,000 extra in the pockets of working people. She could also have mentioned the changes to UC, which for full-time workers also will make them £1,000 better off. Could also have mentioned the record increase in the national insurance threshold, which will make nearly 30 million households better off, or any of the other measures we're taking through the Levelling Up agenda, the £4.8 billion being spent through the Levelling Up Fund, the £3.6 billion through the Towns Fund, the £2.6 billion that is helping to transform town centres across this country. None of these things got a mention in her question, I noticed.
Listen,
you know, increasingly, Mr. Speaker, it's like they're living on a completely different planet. You know, the Secretary of State was in Stoke the other day. Stoke is a place that has had £35 million taken off them by him from money that used to flow freely back to us via Brussels. It's had £20 million stripped out of the local economy because they scrapped the £20 uplift in universal credit. And look, the bigger problem is that there is a pattern emerging here. He couldn't get money from the Chancellor. He couldn't get visas from the Home Secretary. He couldn't convince his own former junior ministers to stop closures of work and pensions offices in the north. I mean, he couldn't even persuade his own civil servants on Levelling Up to move out of London. For all this nonsense, 2/3 of his civil servants working on Levelling Up are trying to level us up from the capital. At least now he knows what it's like for the rest of us in the north, Scotland, the Midlands, Wales and the South West to be treated with total contempt by a bunch of ministers in Whitehall. Seriously, what hope has he got of convincing us in this country that he can level us up when he can't even convince a single one of his colleagues around the cabinet table?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for drawing attention to the Cabinet's visit to Stoke the other day. If she had been a government backbencher, Mr. Speaker, people would have accused her of toadying for teeing up this question so brilliantly. But she mentions several things. It allows me to mention the 3 successful Levelling Up bids that we've had in Stoke. It also allows me to mention a point that she just raised about the Shared Prosperity Fund. Under the last Labour government, money was decided on in Brussels, then given to remote regional development agencies. Now that money is going directly, with no strings attached, to the fantastic Conservative-run council in Stoke, which is transforming the fortunes of that city after years of Labour neglect.
SNP spokesperson Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the bullish posturing, the Minister knows that households across the UK are suffering terrible hardship because of the cost of living crisis, which has got the Tories' name written all over it. And despite the rhetoric, the reality is that Scotland's resource budget allocation has been cut by Westminster by 5.2%, and the capital budget allocation has been cut by Westminster by 9.7% in real terms. How can the Minister claim to be supporting economic growth across the UK when the Scottish Government's ability to support business, investment and people during the cost of living crisis can be nothing but severely constrained by these cuts?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady talks about the Scottish public spending. The truth is that the record block grant that Scotland has just received is the biggest settlement since devolution. It's a huge settlement. And for every £100 of spending elsewhere, there is £126 worth of public spending in Scotland. Well, the implication of her question is just not correct.
Andrew Percy.
Speaker, the problem for the Shadow Secretary of State is that some of us remember what 13 years of a Labour government meant for the north of England, where we received very little. Since we came to power, not only has this government cut the Humber Bridge tolls in half, supported the development of the Siemens wind turbine factory in Hull, and of course supported the development of the new Siemens train factory in Goole, we've also received huge sums of cash through the town deals that are coming our way and other money. However, we want more. We want even more, Mr Speaker. So whilst we missed out first time round on the Levelling Up Fund bid, can the Minister assure me that he'll look very closely at the bids that are about to be submitted from my area for the next round of those funding?
Minister.
I will, of course, look very closely, and I hope that through the very exciting talks that are going on the Hull and East Riding devolution deal, that we can pick up many more of the exciting opportunities in the area. Of course, the reviews of Labour's performance in Hull are so good that they've literally just been kicked out of the council.
Justin Mathers.
Question number 7, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, we know how important multi-year certainty is to local authorities, and we aim to provide that whenever possible. We are making available £54.1 billion to local government in England through this year's settlement, which is an increase of up to £3.7 billion from last year. And we are also providing an additional £1.6 billion of grant funding per year across the spending review period.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Long-term challenges do need long-term solutions, and I think we've had too much of an ad hoc bidding war which creates winners and losers, and a perfect example of that is my constituency, where in the last 3 years we've had the Future High Streets Fund bid rejected, the Towns Fund bid rejected, the Restore Your Railway Fund bid rejected, Levelling Up Fund bid rejected, the Bus Back Better Fund rejected. Any one of those could have made a real difference in our constituency, but each time we are back to square one. So can the Minister see that in order to truly level up, we need a strategy, not a lottery?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I'm sorry that his area has not been successful in receiving funds, but I would remind him that they have received £12.6 million of the Shared Prosperity Fund. The levelling up bids are competitive, and the strength of the bid is part of the reason, is part of how they are measured. So I would encourage him and his local authorities to continue trying.
Now come to Shadow Minister Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. A new study by the CBR shows that by the end of next year, more than half of the UK's slowest growing economies will be in the north of England. So much for the government's commitment to level up the country. If we want true levelling up, we need proper regional investment, but instead what we have is a rolling series of beauty parades: the Levelling Up Fund, the Towns Fund, High Street Fund, Buses Fund, Brownfield Fund, and all the others as said. Do ministers really believe that levelling up is best served by making communities come to Whitehall, cap in hand, where only some can win but most must lose?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that competitive funding has its place, and we think that it has been an effective tool for protecting value for taxpayers' money. And he does know, as I said in the answer to his colleague, that that's not the only funding that we are providing. We have increased the funding for local government by £3.7 billion.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Honourable Lady knows that the story for local government over the last decade has been a devastating one. And the reality is that even if you're successful in the bids I talk about, you're still worse off overall due to government cuts. Because with this government, the reality never matches the press release. And we see this repeated once again with the Shared Prosperity Fund. The 2019 Tory Party manifesto promised it would match the fund it replaces. Now we actually see that it's worth hundreds of millions less. So I asked the Minister what I asked the Secretary of State last month and received only a grammar lesson in response. Levelling up's a sham, isn't it?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I completely reject the assertion made by the honourable member. It is not true that the Shared Prosperity Fund is less. It is. It is more, and they are looking at different sources of funding in order to arrive at those inaccurate figures. If he would like us to explain to him how it works, I'd be very happy to provide him with a letter.
Patricia Gibson, the SNP spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Devastating and forensic analysis by Bloomberg on the progress of the UK government's so-called levelling up agenda has found there is no overall levelling up progress recorded in Scotland. On the contrary, the UK government is levelling down Scotland compared with London, which has significant levelling up funding and gains since 2019, with disparities across the UK widening. So to what extent does the Minister agree with Bloomberg's analysis with the fact that the Tories are levelling down Scotland and prioritising the south of England?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm afraid it is not something, it's not a statement that we accept. I looked at the Bloomberg figures and I noticed that they were using a baseline from 2019, when actually the whole purpose of levelling up is to ensure that we solve the problems which they have identified. So what I would ask the Honourable Lady to do is actually to look at the metrics which we have put in the Levelling Up white paper and those missions. That is how we're going to level up across the country.
Yeah. Big Whitley.
What's your name, Mr Speaker?
Stand up when you're
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This government remains committed to the right to buy and spreading the dream of home ownership to even more people. The Midlands pilot of the voluntary right to buy completed in 2021 and an independent evaluation was published, and we are currently reviewing the findings and will announce further details in due course.
Big Whitley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There's a definite shortage of social housing in this country, with over 1 million households waiting for social homes. But rather than take the decisive action that needed to get to grips with this housing crisis, Minister have instead threatened suggesting their manifesto commitments to building 300,000 affordable homes a year, refused to commit to building the council house we desperately need, and are now openly considering extending rights to buy to housing associations' properties. Will the Secretary of State concede that an extension of the right to buy scheme makes the housing shortage much worse and cause continued misery for so many millions, and deal a grievous blow to the hopes of thousands of my constituents who just want somewhere that they can call home?
Minister.
Well, I'm afraid the honourable gentleman is completely wrong in the statements that he's made. We have got a very ambitious affordable homes programme, over £11 billion being spent on a whole range of different options. We are also making sure that we bring in an infrastructure levy that gives as much, if not more, contributions for the delivery of affordable homes. And I don't understand why he's got a problem with giving people in social housing the opportunity to become homeowners. I have to tell him that on the council estate I grew up on, it made a real transformational difference for the social mobility of those families who were able to enjoy that great policy.
Mohammed Yassin.
Number 10, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I mentioned before, this year's local government finance settlement makes available £54.1 billion for councils in England, which is an increase of £3.7 billion on last year, to ensure councils have the resources they need to deliver key services. I should mention that this also includes over £1 billion for councils to meet social care pressures and a new unring-fenced 2022-23 services grant worth £822 million.
Johnson.
Mr Speaker, the government's actions in cutting Bedford Borough Council's revenue support grant from over 30 million in 2015 to just 6.1 million in 2022-23 has meant local authorities are forced to raise council tax precepts to meet vital costs. The adult social care burden is ever increasing and cannot be paid for unless the RSG is increased to a realistic level. So will the Minister tell us today when the fair funding review will finally be published?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable gentleman for raising this issue. We do recognise that adult social care costs are increasing, and that's why we have provided additional funding. And even for his own borough of Bedford, we provided an additional £2 million for this settlement year. So we will continue to look at the pressures which councils are under, but I would like to remind him that this settlement did significantly increase budgets. Bedford Borough Council actually had a core spending power increase of 6.5% compared to last year, worth £9.6 million. That makes it available up to £156 million worth of spending.
Shadow Minister Mike Ainsworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Ministers can't escape the fact that the National Audit Office says 50% of central government grant funding has been cut from local authorities up and down the land by 50% since 2010. And yet, ministers live on this parallel universe, where less is more if we look at the Shared Prosperity Fund, where millions have been taken out, and the consequences are all too plain to see. We've even got Sir Rod Stewart doing a DIY on filling in potholes in Essex, certainly a county that the minister will be familiar with, to a third of libraries closing up and down the land in this country. They're real consequences. At what stage is the minister going to grasp the bull by the horns and provide the fair funding to local authorities based on genuine need, not competition, not jumping through unnecessary bureaucratic hoops, but provide first-class public services for all?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would remind the honourable gentleman that the reason why we have had such difficulties in local government spending is because of the terrible state of public finances, which this government found when it came into power 10 years ago. And it is only because of the hard work that we have done over the last decade repairing the public finances that we have been able to provide additional funding for local governments.
Question 11, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is essential to our planning reforms. The Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill introduces a new infrastructure levy. This will ensure that developers contribute funding for infrastructure like schools, GP surgeries and new roads, and give local authorities control over how it is provided to best meet the needs of local people and new development.
Richard Fuller.
Mr. Speaker, can I encourage the Minister in his push for infrastructure first with an example from my own constituency? Some years ago, quite a few years ago, a developer in the village of Biddenham proposed and gave some land for a GP surgery to be located there, bringing GPs patients from Biddenham and neighbouring village of Bromham. In the intervening period, all the houses have been built, but not a part of that new GP surgery has been built. But it is good news because it will start later this year. But can the Minister assure me that some of the interactions between the CCG, Bedford Borough Council, NHS estates, the GPs themselves, the developer and the builder will be cleared up in this? No one's to blame, but I bet you if the Minister had done infrastructure first already, we'd already have that GP surgery today.
Minister.
I completely agree with my honourable friend that councils and health bodies and everybody needs to get much better at this, because local planning authorities and CCGs should be working together to provide the planned provision. Under our new levy, councils will be able to borrow against future levy receipts to forward fund the infrastructure that is needed. But I am currently arranging meetings with colleagues in the Department for Health to discuss the very issue that he has brought to our attention today.
It is vital that infrastructure is provided before development is allowed. It's also vital that houses are given planning permission, or that are given planning permission, are then used for the purposes that was agreed when they were given planning permission in the first place. I'm talking about second home ownership. Homes that were built for local families that end up being second homes and leading to communities being hollowed out. Would he agree to look again at the bill that is coming, to look at bringing in a new change of use so that second homes and holiday lets are separate categories of planning use, so that homes in Cumbria can remain for local families and not just become part of ghost towns?
Well, the issue of second homes is something that I seem to be dealing with on a daily basis, with colleagues from around the country raising it with me and highlighting some of the concerns they have for their communities. We have in the bill the ability for local councils to increase council tax on those second homes, but I think there is more that we need to explore, and that's why I'm doing a series of roundtables around the country, and maybe I can come up to the Lake District to do one there.
Come on.
Speaker, on-site community facilities are also vitally important. Last summer, I visited St Clement's development in East Ipswich, where Bovis, Vistry and Trinity Estate Management have failed to meet many of their obligations. The Foxhall Community Centre was meant to be brought back into use, isn't being brought back into use. Many concerns over littering, lighting. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss how we can hold developers to account to make sure they do not let residents down like they have done at St Clement's development?
Minister.
Again, I'm happy to meet my honourable friend, and he's right. It goes back to the point that when communities think a development is coming and the benefit for them will be whatever it is, and then it is not developed, it erodes trust in the whole planning system, and that is exactly what our bill is designed to try and address, so that communities can have more engagement and can have confidence that what has been agreed will actually be delivered.
Very sharp.
Mr. Speaker, will the Minister wake up to the reality of what's going on up and down the country in local authorities, where, because of the cutbacks since the 2010 election, we have absolutely run down the resource of every planning department in the country.
True.
There are not enough professionals being trained. There are not enough people there to provide an adequate service. What's he going to do about planning authorities up and down this country that can't deliver for the public?
Minister?
Well, one of the points about the infrastructure levy is that we take out the whole necessity for negotiation. This will be a set levy that developers cannot wriggle out of. It will be for local authorities to set what that levy will be. But of course, we are looking at the broader issues he raises, and I will hopefully report on more of that in the future.
Simon Feld.
Number 12, sir.
Minister.
The department is delivering the government's plan to empower local leaders, including offering devolution deals to anywhere in England that wants one by 2030.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, may I thank the Levelling Up Secretary for visiting Barrow recently to see the £25 million town deal and the £16 million Levelling Up Fund and how it will transform our community. But on to the point, Cumbria's just elected its first ever councillors to the new Westmoreland and Furness and Cumberland authorities. It's a historic moment for our county. And would my honourable friend agree with me that there's further for them to go, and the new councillors have got the opportunity to secure a bountiful devolution deal and supercharge the county with an elected mayor? What advice would he give to them?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. When I was in Barrow-in-Furness a couple of weeks ago, I was very struck by the fantastic progress that my honourable friend is helping to drive forward using Levelling Up funds, the Marina Village, the new bridge, the new university campus and more. But I was also struck by the common linkages and opportunities across Cumbria, and I can see the case for an ambitious devolution deal covering both the new authorities once they're up and running.
We now come to topicals. Anthony Brown.
Topicals number 2.
Sir Stake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Across government, the Places for Growth programme has seen civil servants relocated from London and the South East to different parts of the United Kingdom, whether that's been Treasury civil servants going to Darlington in County Durham, or whether it's been Home Office officials going to Stoke-on-Trent on Staffordshire, or indeed my own officials relocating to Wolverhampton in the West Midlands. Over the weekend, there was speculation in some newspapers that that estimable effort by civil servants should be joined by members of the other place. Can I say that I would wholeheartedly welcome the relocation of the House of Lords to one of our great cities, and in particular the attractions of the 6 towns that constitute Stoke-on-Trent, as I saw last week, are formidable. And if the House of Lords were to relocate to Stoke-on-Trent, I think you could be assured of a warm welcome in one of the most attractive places in England.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. North Stowe in my constituency is the biggest new town in the UK for 50 years, the biggest since Milton Keynes. It now has 1,000 houses, but it has no dedicated community centre, no permanent cafe, no pub, no shop. There's thousands of frustrated residents without anywhere to go for a pint of milk or a pint of beer. This new town's also causing environmental problems. There's flooding in the neighbouring village of Swavesey, while in the neighbouring village of Longstow it's running short of water. Both of these problems rise from the same common fault of the failure of the local planning authority. Will my right honourable friend tell me what his department might do to be able to address these problems and make sure they don't happen in future as North Stowe is built out to 10,000 homes?
Can I just remind people, it is topicals, they're meant to be short and quick and not a war and peace.
Steps taken in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill and changes to the National Planning Policy Framework should absolutely address the problems that he's identified. But of course the biggest problem that my honourable friend has identified is the fact that sadly in South Cambridgeshire they have a Liberal Democrat controlled local planning authority that doesn't care about community but pursues a narrow political agenda to the detriment of all.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With rent levels in the private sector surging and local housing allowance frozen once again, millions of hard-pressed tenants across the country are at risk of arrears and eviction. We know that rent tribunals are not an effective safeguard against punitive rent rises, and that the risk of such rises is only likely to increase when Section 21 no-fault evictions are finally scrapped. Can the Secretary of State therefore tell the House why his planned Renters Reform Bill appears completely silent on the issue of protections for tenants against unaffordable rent rises?
Our renters reform bill will specifically ensure that people in the private rented sector are protected, and I look forward to working with the honourable gentleman in order to ensure that legislation satisfies the need of the hour.
Craig Tracy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. North Warwickshire Borough Council does a fantastic job serving our local community, despite operating on a budget of only £9.5 million, which is certainly the lowest in Warwickshire, must be one of the lowest in the country. So will the Minister agree to come and meet me in the constituency, to meet with the Council and see for himself the excellent work that they do, and also how they could put some of the current Levelling Up Fund on offer to excellent use?
Minister.
Well, I would pay tribute to David Wright and North Warwickshire Borough Council, because they've done a fantastic job, particularly during COVID, supporting the local community and local businesses. I'd be delighted to visit, to hop across the A5, not least because you're only 20 minutes away from Hartborough.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just last year, Shropshire's Conservative-run council missed out on 3 levelling up bids and also missed out on a bus service improvement plan bid under the Bus Back Better Fund this year. There's no doubt that Shropshire has need for these funds, so I'd like to understand what steps is the Secretary of State taking to ensure that levelling up funds are allocated based on need rather than some sort of opaque bidding process which seems to be influenced by a council's ability to direct resources at that bid?
We allocate levelling up fund bids, as the Minister for Local Government pointed out earlier, on the basis of appropriate competition in order to ensure value for money. But I've had a chance to talk to the excellent Conservative leader of Shropshire Council, Leslie Picton, in order to make sure that she and her superb team of Conservative councillors can deliver for the people of Shropshire, as Conservatives always have.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend for delivering the Shared Prosperity Fund? Historically high funding for Mid Wales, Montgomeryshire in particular, over £200 per head. Can I thank him in particular for the golden thread of rurality that you find in this formula, and press him to continue delivering for rural communities?
Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons why Mid Wales has one of the highest shared prosperity allocations in the country is precisely that we have taken rurality into account and the additional costs that come with that. I look forward to building on that.
Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear that the government's approach to levelling up is a postcode lottery based on their own political ambitions rather than a genuine desire to help communities. With Portsmouth's high streets in dire need of investment and our city's cultural attractions struggling with the cost of living, when will the Minister stop moving the goalposts and finally stop shortchanging Portsmouth?
Tuesday.
Well, I think that scored quite high on the cliché count, postcode lottery, moving the goalposts, narrow political calculation. Instead of rehearsing for YouTube clips, I'm afraid the honourable member would be better employed actually looking at what we have done, not just for Portsmouth and Southampton, but also for communities including Liverpool and Birkenhead, where it has been this government that has been responsible for ensuring that local government receives the support it needs. I'm afraid that the honourable gentleman, if he wants to hang on to his seat, would better be employed concentrating on delivering for his residents, not making party political points.
Secretary of State, don't spoil a good day. You're having a good day so far, don't ruin it. Felicity Bucket.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I and my Kensington residents welcome the fact that the social housing bill was in the Queen's speech. Will my right honourable friend confirm that this bill will give social housing tenants the ability to hold their landlords to account? And will he also detail what is to be the likely timing of the bill?
Minister, come on.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Eventually. Well, my honourable friend is quite right. The social housing bill will help her social housing tenants in Kensington hold their landlords to account. But we're not waiting, Mr. Speaker, for the new legislation. We're driving a campaign through the Make Things Right campaign to make sure that tenants understand. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm disappointed. The people opposite think it's funny. I think it's completely appropriate, Mr. Speaker, that tenants are able to hold their landlords to account. We're making sure they understand how to do so and how to escalate complaints to the Housing Ombudsman should that be necessary.
Ms. Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week's Bloomberg report suggests that levelling up in Scotland is just not happening. Given that Scotland is self-sufficient in gas and offshore renewables, shouldn't the stewardship, the licensing and revenues be linked to the Scottish Government budget rather than to Her Majesty's Treasury? Minister, when will these negotiations start, and can we kick-start some serious levelling up?
Mistake.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for raising the importance of the two governments working together, the Scottish Government and the UK Government, on levelling up. And that's why I'm so pleased that, working with the Finance Minister in the Scottish Government, Kate Forbes, we've been able to agree a prospectus for 2 new free ports in Scotland. I'm sure that Fife will be one of the communities, one of the areas, one of the local authorities which will be working with the UK Government in order to exploit the opportunities that free ports provide outside the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the proposals to ensure empty shops have to be rented, but could the Minister explain who they will be rented to, whether this will enable upper floors to be converted to much-needed affordable housing, and when we will see progress on filling key, visible empty units in town centres such as Barnstaple?
I thank my honourable friend for the question, and high street rental auctions will apply to commercial property and make tenancies more accessible to businesses and community groups. And we recognise the importance of diversifying high streets, and we've introduced permitted development rights to allow a wide range of commercial buildings to change to residential use without the need for a planning application. But dependent on the circumstances and the type of building, my honourable friend is right that there could also be opportunities to increasing housing in areas like hers where there are real challenges.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Homes for Ukraine, matching with hosts is left to the individuals involved to sort out for themselves, often through ad hoc Facebook groups, and that's led, not surprisingly, to reports like, quote, Ukrainian refugees using Facebook groups to seek a safe home in the UK are being put at risk of sexual exploitation. Criminal record checks on their own can't prevent this. What assurance can the Minister give us about the rigour and effectiveness of the separate home checks undertaken for the scheme?
Well, the right honourable gentleman raises a very important question. And first of all, I'm very grateful to the more than 100,000 UK citizens who have signed up in order to offer their homes for the scheme. It is the case that as well as criminal record and police national computer checks before visas are granted, it is also the case that there are vetting and barring and other checks, often conducted by local authorities themselves, before individuals, or rather at the time that individuals find themselves in homes. But I'd be more than happy to provide the right honourable gentleman and others with a full briefing about the processes which we undertake.
Henry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In my constituency of Broxtowe, the Borough Council have recently built new housing for military veterans, specifically for them. And as an ex-service person myself, I was delighted to see this. But can the Minister please outline what more the Government is doing to make sure there's housing for our veterans?
Minister, briefly.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question and for his service to his country. The Government is committed to making the UK the best place in the world to be a veteran. Veterans with urgent housing needs are always given high priority for social housing, and we're also investing £11.5 billion under the Affordable Homes Programme to deliver more social homes, including housing for veterans.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For many in the privately rented sector, the Government is like Rome, fiddling while Rome burns. When are they going to get on and publish the timetable for the Renters Reform Bill? This is the third Queen's speech in which it has been mentioned, and yet there is still no timetable, while Section 21 evictions are on the increase in many of our constituencies.
Well, the honourable lady suggests that we're being Neronian in fiddling while Rome burns. But in fact, I prefer to think that we are like Julius Caesar. We have crossed the Rubicon. Alia jacta est. The dice has been thrown, the die has been cast, and this bill will be on the statute book in this parliamentary session.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Forget-Me-Not group in Blythe are working hard to secure better opportunities for everyone in their local area of Coop and Key. However, they need a base in the community to house and deliver their services. Mr. Speaker, this is grassroots levelling up. So would my right honourable friend please agree to meet with me to discuss exactly what we can do to help these people?
Well, my honourable friend is quite right to highlight the work of the Forget-Me-Not group in Blythe, who are doing amazing work in Cap and Key, and I will do everything I can in order to support them and meet with him in order to do so.
Catherine Smith.
Mr. Speaker. Will Ministers join me in recognising and commending the work of LL Parish Councillor Lisa Corkery? She's never afraid to don the marigolds, grab the litter pickers and clean up goal gates. However, Lisa would like to know when the Government's going to fund local authorities adequately enough that she can put her efforts to making her community better rather than just clearing up the mess left behind by others.
Well, the local councillor that the Honourable Lady mentioned sounds like an absolutely brilliant champion for her local community. I'd love to know more, and in particular know more about what we can do in practical terms to help, and look forward to working with her.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Energy performance improvements to domestic dwellings is an important part of the government's agenda towards climate change obligations, as well as the cost of living. But can I draw my right honourable friend's attention to the private rented off-grid properties, where the potential to achieve energy performance improvements is much more difficult and much more expensive than we would see in normal domestic dwellings?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is indeed going to be much more challenging, and that's why I'm working very closely with Minister Lord Callaghan to see how we can address this problem, and I look forward to discussing this further with my honourable friend to see how we find an appropriate solution in the future.
Graham Morris.
Many agree that levelling up investment should not be a competition, but instead should be a considered plan created in partnership between central and local government to address the areas of greatest need. Ministers are meeting with lots of Conservative MPs, but would the Minister meet with me to discuss the levelling bid for my area to fund the Horden Master Plan, as well as identifying funding for other much-needed regeneration schemes in Easington Colliery and Peterlee Town Centre?
Well, Durham is on the up, and East Durham must be part of that story, so of course we'll make sure that a minister meets with him in order to discuss what we can do to help.
I'm still clearing the...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Full fibre broadband coverage is essential to the government's aims to level up, but we lag behind most of Europe in rollout. What discussions has the Minister had with the Culture Secretary to ensure government have a strategy to work with industry to improve coverage and speed up progress in both rural and urban areas of the devolved nations that currently have the poorest broadband?
Well, the Culture Secretary and I talk daily. And one of the things that's top of our agenda is making sure that we have connectivity across the whole of the United Kingdom, and we are of course working with the devolved administrations in order to ensure that every citizen of the United Kingdom benefits from UK government investment.
Dan Jarvis.
I'm sure the Secretary of State will want to acknowledge the increasingly important role played by Metro mayors, so can I encourage him to make contact with Mayor Tracy Brabin, the excellent Metro Mayor for West Yorkshire, who now chairs the M10, the cross-party group of mayors, to ensure that we've got the closest working relationship between government nationally, regionally and locally.
Yes, can I take the opportunity to thank the honourable gentleman for his years of service as Metro Mayor for South Yorkshire, during which all party political differences aside, he did a superb job. And can I also congratulate his successor, Oliver Coppard, on taking on that role. I look forward to working with Oliver and, of course, with Tracy Brabin in the years ahead.
Bill Estes.
One of my constituents wants to sponsor a family of Ukrainian children, but the pause in applications has delayed their ability to travel here because they're travelling separately. The delay can't be about safeguarding, as ministers have claimed, because it's made them less safe. So will the Secretary of State intervene with his ministerial colleagues and enable Ukrainian children who are at risk to reach sanctuary in this country as soon as possible?
Minister Secretary.
I can't comment on any individual case, but it is absolutely the government's responsibility to ensure that as many Ukrainian parents and children benefit from our scheme. We have to balance safeguarding concerns and indeed the policy of the Ukrainian government, but he raises an important question and more will follow.
Maura.
Thank you. The Levelling Up White Paper offered practically no new investment for the North East, but it did have grandiose missions. Now we see from the draft bill that those missions can be changed, and the targets can be changed at will by ministers. So isn't that a cheater's charter? And are the missions worth the White Paper they're written on?
Well, Newcastle has benefited not just from great civic leadership from Nick Forbes, now sadly no longer the leader of Newcastle City Council as a result, sadly, of a Corbynite coup. But I want to say thank you to him for his leadership, and also stress that the reason why the missions can change is because we live in a democracy, and this House should be capable of deciding the destiny of this nation. And for that reason, I know the Honourable Lady finds the idea of democracy laughable, but democracy, I'm afraid, returned a Conservative government in 2019 in order to level up and unite this country, and that is the mission we will fulfil.
Final question, Dave Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State likes to discuss in abstract policy terms the Shared Prosperity Fund, but let's bring it back to brass tacks. In Angus, in 2019, we received £2,750,186 from the EU's structural fund. Can he assure my constituents that we will get at least that, plus inflation, minus the Union Jack ribbon?
Well, I think whether it's in Arbroath, Montrose or Kerrymuir, people will recognise the vital importance of UK shared prosperity funding and other funding going. But when he talks about no Union Jack ribbon, is he really suggesting, for example, that UK armed forces who are based in Arbroath and Montrose should leave? Is that what he's suggesting? Is he suggesting that we rip up the Union Jack in order to make a narrow nationalist political point? Does he want the Marines? Does he want the Marines to leave his constituency? That's what it sounds like to me. And it sounds to me as though he is more prepared to make a narrow partisan nationalist point than to see this country defended at a time of testing.
You know, I'm almost tempted to another question, but let's move on. We now come to the urgent question, where I call upon Bambus Charlams.
To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs if she will make a statement on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom government was shocked to hear of the very sad death of the respected and renowned journalist Shireen Abu Akleh whilst working in the West Bank. On the 11th of May, the Foreign Secretary and UK ministers made clear our concern, and we have called for a thorough investigation into the events. On the 13th of May, in company with the other members of the UN Security Council, we strongly condemned the killing and stressed the importance of an immediate, thorough, transparent, fair and impartial investigation, and stressed the need to ensure accountability. The work of journalists across the globe is vital, and they must be protected to carry out their work and defend media freedom. We were also deeply distressed by the scenes at the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh on Friday. Her death was a tragedy, and those mourning must be treated with respect and dignity. The situation on the ground makes clear the need to make progress towards a peaceful two-state solution, and the UK stands ready to support.
We now cut to Bambus Charlams.
Shireen Abu Akleh was a veteran correspondent for Al Jazeera's Arabic news channel, and on Wednesday the 11th of May she was killed while covering Israeli army raids in the city of Jenin in the northern occupied West Bank. Her killing has been widely condemned by world leaders, the UN and members of civil society, and it has shocked the world. The killing of Shireen Abu Akleh is not only an outrageous act, but an attack on the freedom of the media and the independence of journalists working around the world, playing a crucial role in reporting conflicts, seeking truth and telling stories of those affected. On Friday, deeply disturbing footage was released following Shireen's funeral. The scenes of violence at the funeral were appalling, and Israeli police were seen firing tear gas at mourners and attacking them with batons, almost causing the pallbearers to drop the coffin, nearly sending it crashing to the ground. The attacks on mourners were indefensible and only heightened demands for justice and pain felt by Shireen's family. The Labour Party unequivocally condemns the violence by Israeli forces. International law and human rights must be upheld, and we stand with all those demanding accountability for the killing of Shireen, and there must be an urgent, independent and impartial inquiry to secure this. More widely, we will continue to support justice and the protection of human rights of Palestinian people and a sovereign Palestinian state alongside a secure Israel. Tensions in the region were already high. Israel has seen a number of deadly terrorist attacks, and both Israelis and Palestinians have been killed in what has been the worst wave of violence and attacks in Israel in years. We're deeply concerned that Shireen's death and the treatment of mourners at her funeral could spark further cycles of violence. So I therefore ask the Minister whether she has made any representations to her Israeli counterparts on the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, whether the Minister will condemn the violence at Shireen's funeral, and finally whether she can confirm whether her department will stand up for international law and human rights by encouraging an independent inquiry to the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, so that we can ensure that there is accountability for her death.
Minister.
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments? He's absolutely right that Shireen's death was outrageous and shocked the world. And he's also right to speak about the very disturbing scenes at her funeral. It is so important that mourners are paid respect, that they're paid dignity, and actually that the deceased is shown respect and shown dignity. And this was immediately called out over the weekend also by my co-minister, Lord Ahmed, who was immediately stated about this. He's asked about the investigation, and what we're doing is working with other members at the UN Security Council to give that very firm statement that we want this investigation. It needs to be immediate, it needs to be thorough, and also, crucially, it needs to be impartial. Thank you very much.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for an answer to the urgent question. Clearly, there is a concern that we don't know exactly what happened on that terrible day when the journalist was killed. Does my honourable friend agree with me that we do need an independent investigation in which both the Government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority cooperate so that there is a full and thorough investigation which can be seen to be independent? And does she regret the fact that the Palestinian Authority are refusing to hand over the bullet that killed the journalist?
Minister.
My honourable friend, as ever, is so right. It is absolutely key that this investigation happens swiftly, that it is thorough, and that it is impartial.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we on these benches unequivocally condemn the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, one of the Arab world's most respected journalists, shot dead by the Israeli army despite wearing full press coverings, body armour and a helmet. Shireen's death takes to 50 the number of journalists who have been killed by the Israeli occupation forces in the last 20 years, death for which no one has ever been held to account. It is absolutely essential, therefore, that along with the EU and the United States and the UN, that all democracies unreservedly condemn this killing, and all who support a full, impartial and transparent investigation must be supported. Does she agree that this investigation should be carried out by the International Criminal Court, so that the person responsible for this awful crime can be found and tried, and if convicted, given an appropriate sentence? And what sanction does she think would be appropriate against Israel in those circumstances? And finally, will she also unreservedly condemn the disgraceful actions of the Israeli police, who on Friday attacked her cortege with batons and stun grenades, denying her, even in death, any sort of dignity or respect?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right that the killing has been condemned across the world, and indeed it has been condemned by us in the UK. We have called, as I said before, for that immediate, thorough, transparent, fair and impartial investigation. I think it's really important that that happens soon, and it happens in a way that is very, very thorough. I think we were all also completely shocked by the scenes at her funeral. We are deeply concerned about the rise in violence attacks in the area, and continue to call for peace in the area, as we have always done so. Working to deliver peace is our absolute top priority. But she was an incredibly respected journalist. He's right also to point to the risk to journalists across the world. And in fact, I believe that 26 journalists have been killed across the world during this year, 6 in Ukraine. It may even be more since that update I received. We must stand for journalists and for media freedom.
Andrew Jones.
David Jones.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is entirely right to express concern over the scenes at the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh. But given that there can be absolutely no doubt as to what happened at that funeral, given that mourners and pallbearers were attacked by Israeli soldiers, police officers, can she confirm that the government has already made representations to the Israeli authorities expressing concern and indicating how deplorable those scenes are?
Minister.
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right about the deplorable scenes. We've already stated that we are deeply disturbed by those scenes. We're also looking at what other further measures might be taken, but most importantly, we continue to call for urgent steps to de-escalate tensions and for the restraint and the use of force. It is absolutely vital that tensions are reduced and we get parties back to dialogue to work towards peace.
Just help each other by trying to be brief, because we've major pressures afterwards, but I understand the feeling within. I'm now going to the others that put in for UQ, who unfortunately wasn't taken. Naz Shah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all send my condolences to the family and friends of Shireen Abu Akleh, the true Palestinian heroine who was horrifically shot in the head and murdered. And let's be clear, this is not a one-off attack on journalists or by Israel. We can't forget that Israel actually had a raid last May on the Al Jalal building that hosted Al Jazeera and Associated Press office. And this isn't just a story of Shireen either, but many other journalists, including the 55 Palestinian journalists killed since 2000. And how can the Palestinians have any faith in Israel to hand over a bullet and this so-called, this whitewash of an idea that they're going to investigate when nobody has been held to account over lots and lots of years? So what representations is the Minister making and this government making to his Israeli counterparts to actually make sure we get justice on this occasion, not just for Shireen, but all the Palestinians who are continually being brutalised?
The UK is very concerned by the number of Palestinians who've been killed by Israeli security forces in recent weeks. We continue to urge for thorough and transparent investigations into the deaths of Palestinian civilians and call again for restraint in the use of force.
Robert Halford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is my honourable friend aware that also 19 Israelis have been killed, not including foreign nationals, have been killed from terrorism since March the 21st, and Jewish lives and Israeli lives matter as much as the life of the journalist who tragically lost her life. And is she also aware that the Hamas leader recently incited the Palestinians to act in ways of terrorism, inciting the use of the knife and the gun? And what is she doing to help the Israelis combat terrorism and these awful murders against Israeli citizens?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is an important point. Israel does have a legitimate right to self-defence and the right to defend its citizens from attack. But it is absolutely vital that all actions are proportionate and that they are in line with international humanitarian law, and they must make every effort to avoid civilian casualties.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to send my condolences to Shireen's family, friends and colleagues at Al Jazeera. She was unlawfully killed while doing the job she loved and greatly respected for, while clearly identified as a journalist in what can only be described as a targeted attack for reporting actions of Israeli forces in the occupied territory of Jenin. Does the Minister agree with me that an international criminal court should undertake a full, independent, not impartial investigation and swift action taken to bring those responsible to action? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Can I thank the honourable member for reminding us that there are family and friends here, and I'd also like to add my condolences and the government's condolences to the family and friends of Shireen. Losing such a talented person in such awful situation, my thoughts are with them. We have called for the immediate investigation. That does need to be thorough, that does need to be impartial, because it needs to have the trust of all those in the area, and that's why it is so important that it happens soon.
Crispin Blunt.
Speaker, I draw the attention of the House to my declaration in the Register as a founder director of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. In respect of this, since then I have avoided engagement on Palestinian issues in this House. But this opposition urgent question, in respect of the killing of journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, almost certainly by targeted shot coming from the forces who are in illegal occupation of Palestinian territory, allow me to ask, how long must we wait for the United Kingdom to actually do anything to enforce accountability for the State of Israel on its gross and worsening breach of 55 years of the Fourth Geneva Convention, noting the shaming contrast with our own brave and principled policy towards Ukraine?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is right to be concerned. The UK government is very concerned about this very fragile security situation in Jerusalem. We continue to call on all parties to de-escalate tensions. The British ambassador to Israel and the British Consul General in Jerusalem have been engaging with Israeli and Palestinian leaderships to support them in restoring calm. We've made it clear that there's a need to protect holy sites. This sort of horrific violence against civilians is truly contemptible, and we absolutely call on all sides to de-escalate the situation and come to the dialogue tables and work towards peace.
Steve McCabe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I acknowledge my role as Chair of Labour Friends of Israel. Mr. Speaker, the killing and the events at the funeral are shocking by any standards. I absolutely condemn what happened at the funeral. But as I understand it, she was killed during a gun battle. The facts have not yet been established. The Palestinians have rejected an offer of a joint investigation with the Israelis. Now, surely in this place it helps no one to state as fact what people might want or feel inclined to believe. Can I ask the Minister to do everything in offering British resources and assistance to ensure an independent, impartial investigation is established and that we participate in it if that would be helpful?
Can I thank you for his question? We're also not only calling for that investigation, but also working with other members of the UN Security Council on that joint statement. So it's a joint statement from countries all around the world, strongly condemning the killing and stressing the importance of the investigation.
Thank you
very much, Mr. Speaker. Shireen Abu Akleh has been referred to as the voice of events in Palestine as part of a much-needed open and free press. But there are fears that their killing will spark refreshed conflict in the West Bank. Can my friend assure me that assure this House that if anything can come from this tragedy, that it's the government's priority to secure peace in this region?
Minister.
Our priority in this region has always been to work towards peace. That is why it's absolutely vital that tensions are de-escalated now. That is what we are urging the authorities to do on the ground, de-escalate and come back to dialogue and work towards peace.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I acknowledge my role as Chair of LFPME and the Britain-Palestine APPG. Can the Minister state exactly how the British Government are intending to support an impartial investigation which needs to be independent, as we don't, as a country, this Government has a poor track record on impartial investigations, including the jurisdiction of the ICC, in which the Prime Minister opposed, as well as the UN Commission of Inquiry report on Gaza, from which the UK abstained?
Minister.
So can I thank her for her question? You know, the immediate actions we've been taken are first of all to condemn the situation ourselves and then work with the UN Security Council for that joint statement, both of condemnation but also calling for the investigation. We're obviously using our own diplomatic links, both in Israel and in Jerusalem, engaging with the leaderships, and of course we will always look at what further measures should be taken.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is right to condemn the recent terror attacks on innocent Israelis, which are increasingly being directed from the West Bank by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. She's also right to condemn this killing and to express her belief, which we all share, that journalists should be allowed to report anywhere safely. However, there are too many people who, for whatever reason, sinister or other, who have already determined what the facts are and had done as soon as this story broke. So can I urge you once again to ensure that the UK government's position continues to be in support of an independent inquiry, and that any inquiry to be worth anything at all is going to require the buy-in of both the Israeli government or the Palestinian Authority, or else it will simply become a political dividing line.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think this is precisely why it is so important that the UN Security Council has described in such detail the need for the investigation to be immediate, thorough, transparent, fair, as well as impartial, and made all of those points about this investigation.
Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shireen Abu Akleh was a Christian Palestinian like my family. Her death feels like we've lost a sister. The scenes from the funeral were deeply upsetting, but the Minister may be aware the Israeli police were trying to segregate the Christians from the Muslims in their mourning, and indeed the day before had stormed Shireen's house, went in, disturbed the wake, and took a Palestinian flag from their rooms. It's disgraceful. It's a clear provocation. And I ask the Minister simply this: has she summoned the Israeli ambassador to make clear how unhelpful to the peace process this is?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have made it very clear about the need to restore calm. We have made it very clear that we condemn this action, and we will always look at what further steps should be taken.
Alan Kearns.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shireen Abu Akleh was a respected journalist, and I thank the Minister for her statement. As permanent members of the UN Security Council, I'm pleased at the role the UK played in securing unanimity in its condemnation. Does the Minister share my concerns of what this means to the Palestinian and Israeli community's relationship over the long term? And does she also agree that the best action in memory of Shireen Abu Akleh would be an open and transparent investigation participated by all parties?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he's absolutely right, and as I said in my opening statement, both those who mourn her and her herself should be treated with respect and dignity, and that is again another reason why this investigation needs to be so thorough. It needs to be deep, it needs to be fair, it needs to be impartial, and it needs to happen soon. We are very concerned about the escalating tensions that we've seen over recent weeks and months, increased violence, and it's really important to fight for that calm rather than see more violence.
Mr. Speaker, the reality remains that every time a Palestinian child is born, there is one certainty, that in life they will face persecution, oppression and humiliation at the hands of an occupying Israeli military. But the soul-shattering scenes we saw last week with the funeral procession of Shireen Abu Akleh, brutally attacked by the Israeli security forces, now means that they will be stripped of their dignity in death as well. Yet again, all the international community and this government does is offer empty words. So I ask the Minister, just what is this government waiting for? And why will they not immediately recognise the state of Palestine? And what message is this government sending to Palestinians who have now been stripped of their dignity in life and death?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we consistently call for an immediate end to all actions of violence. We immediately and continue to call against all actions that undermine the viability of a two-state solution. We also are a key development actor in the region, especially working to lift the overall standards of living for Palestinians and meet humanitarian needs. He asks about recognising a Palestinian-type state. We will recognise a Palestinian state at the time when it best serves the objective of peace, because achieving peace is our primary objective.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I draw the House's attention to my entry in the Register of Interests in relation to a recent delegation to Israel and the Palestinian Authority. As has already been stated, the Palestinian Authority have so far refused to participate in a joint investigation into the tragic death of Shireen Abu Akleh. An initial autopsy has found that it is not possible to tell whether she was killed by Israeli or Palestinian gunfire. Facts matter. So does my honourable friend agree that those who, for whatever reason, are jumping to blame Israel will only deepen division and make peace harder to achieve?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is really important that there is a proper investigation, a thorough investigation, a fair investigation, an impartial investigation. But I would also repeat again that we are concerned by the number of Palestinians who have been killed by Israeli security forces in recent weeks. And we urge thorough and transparent investigations into those deaths of civilians as well. It is really important that there is a restraint in the use of force, and we will continue to say that again and again.
Joanna Chorin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A constituent of mine who went to school with Shireen Abu Akleh has been in touch to share her sense of helplessness at what seems to be yet another state-sanctioned killing in the occupied territories. And what she said to me at the weekend is that it seems to her that it's always incumbent on the Palestinians to prove their innocence and fight for basic human sympathy for the events that befall them. Now, I fully accept that the killing has to be investigated independently, but having regard to what followed, the raiding of the home, the appalling behaviour of the Israeli authorities at the funeral, can the Minister please answer the question that she was asked earlier? Will she summon the Israeli ambassador to communicate? Clearly, she feels outrage at what's happened, and she's been very honest about that. So will she summon the Israeli ambassador to communicate her outrage?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear that we have condemned this killing. We absolutely share her concern for the really distressing and disturbing scenes that happened at the funeral. We've called for a thorough investigation. We've called for respect and dignity, and we call for all parties to reduce the tensions and to come and work together towards peace. And delivering peace is what Shireen would have wanted and what we all want.
Michael Fabricant.
As the chairman of Labour Friends of Israel said earlier, this was in the middle of a gun battle between Israeli forces and Palestinian forces. The Labour Friends of Israel chairman is right, and my honourable friend, the member for Buckingham, is also right in saying that the initial autopsy, which was conducted by the Palestinian, not the Israeli authorities, but by the Palestinian authorities, said that it was impossible because the bullet removed was a 5.56 by 45mm NATO round used both by the Israelis and the Palestinians. Therefore, please may I ask my honourable friend, the Minister, to make sure and put pressure to ensure that this is an independent inquiry, because justice must not only be done, justice must be seen to be done.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is right about justice. Justice is really important. We absolutely condemn this killing, and we will continue to stress the need for this investigation to be fair, to be impartial, to be thorough and to be prompt.
John MacDonald.
I'm Secretary of the NUJ Parliamentary Group, and we've raised these issues before, but with regard to this killing, let's put it in the context of a systematic abuse of journalists, Palestinian journalists. The International Federation of Journalists has already, a month ago, referred these incidents to the International Criminal Court. Can I therefore say in that context, and also in view of the happenings subsequent to the killing, which were disgraceful, can I just repeat the question for the third time? Because the minimal action any government can take would be to call the ambassador in to express the concerns of this government about the Israeli state's behaviour. So can we ask for the third time, has the government, or does it intend to invite the Israeli ambassador to the Foreign Office for that discussion?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear about the actions that the government has taken to date. We continue to condemn this. We've called for an investigation. We've made it very clear through our ambassadors in the British Council in Israel and Jerusalem about our position, supporting the leaders to restore calm, the need to protect holy sites, the need for dialogue to move towards peace, and of course we always take any future measures under consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will have heard from across this House members calling for not just an impartial but an independent investigation. And I tell her why, and it matters opposite, because already independent fact-checkers in this modern world have been able to put together compelling open-source evidence which points clearly to the responsibility of the Israeli forces for the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. Given this, will the Minister confirm that it is the UK's official position that there should be an independent inquiry, not just impartial, so that both the Israelis and the Palestinians can have confidence in the outcomes? Will she clarify yes or no?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's really important that we work with partners across the world through the UN Security Council, and it is the UN Security Council's wording that is agreed between all of those countries that calls for an impartial investigation. Those are the wordings that have been agreed by the UN Security Council.
Mr. Speaker, I find the heartbreaking, after decades of violence, illegal occupation, demolition of Palestinian homes, and complete disregard of the human rights, the UK has failed its obligation and duty to recognise the State of Israel. It took the Foreign Secretary more than 24 hours to put out a statement after the murder of Al Jazeera's esteemed journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. What message does that send to those responsible for Shireen's tragic murder? And in light of the history, why the government is not pushing for full independent inquiry? And given the close relationship between the UK and Israel, and now for the fourth time, will the Minister summon the Israeli ambassador to demonstrate the outrage over the behaviour of security forces during the Shireen's funeral?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Shireen's death was a true tragedy. We have condemned it. We have, as I said, on the 11th of May, the Foreign Secretary condemned it. We've also worked very rapidly with our colleagues at the UN Security Council to deliver that joint statement of condemnation and to call for the investigation that I have mentioned. We continue to press for peace, and obviously we saw those very distressing images at the funeral, and we'll always will look at what further steps should be taken.
Ray Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I refer to my register of members' interests, including being co-chair of the cross-party NUJ group and various Palestinian groups. I just want the Minister and members to imagine for a moment attending the funeral of a family member or friend. In what circumstances would it be reasonable or proportionate to see a pallbearer or pallbearers carrying a coffin in the circumstances that we witnessed on our TV screens? How can it be acceptable for the police or security services of any nation to attack the pallbearers to the extent that the coffin falls on the ground? We call not only for her condemnation, but for a fifth time, I call on the Minister to summon the Israeli ambassador here to account for her actions.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've attended many funerals in my life from early childhood. That's one that will always stay with me. Mourners should always be treated with respect and dignity. Shireen and her family should have been treated with respect and dignity. We totally condemn her death and the manner in which she died. We believe that this really urgent investigation is needed in order to try and help rebuild peace. And that must be our priority.
Liz Roberts.
The International Federation of Journalists' complaint to the ICC over the treatment of Palestinian journalists is not only about protecting the human rights of journalists, but also about safeguarding their work they do as a profession to protect collective human rights. Now, the Secretary of State has talked on many times about the need for an independent and impartial investigation. In order to ensure that independence and impartiality, will she support the IJF's complaint to the International Criminal Court to ensure those very virtues?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I said, we've been working with our friends and other members of the UN Security Council on that joint statement about the investigation. I don't have any other further details that I can share with her at this present time.
Zara Sultan.
Speaker, as if the ongoing dispossession and discrimination faced by the Palestinian people wasn't enough cruelty, Israel continuously targets Palestinian journalists. It is not only the murder by Israeli snipers of Shireen Abu Akleh, who for decades bravely reported the crimes inflicted on her people. Since 2000, Israel has killed an estimated 51 Palestinian journalists, and an independent UN Commission of Inquiry found out that during the 2018 March of Return, Israeli snipers intentionally shot Palestinian journalists who were clearly marked as such, killing Yasser Mutaja and Ahmed Abu Hussein. So what will it take for the government to stop equivocating over these horrific crimes, to hold Israel to account for its routine violations of international humanitarian law, and for the 7th time, will the Minister summon the Israeli ambassador?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we stand by journalists all across the world, and it is a tragedy that so many journalists have been killed in recent years, and in particular in this year. That is why we continue to raise issues of media freedom on the global stage. Back in February in Estonia, we announced support for the Secretariat for the Media Freedom Coalition. The Media Freedom Coalition, which we founded, now has 52 members, and we will absolutely stand for media freedom and for journalists all across the world.
Carol Monaghan.
Mr. Speaker, it is important that the Minister has condemned this killing this afternoon, and I thank her for doing that, as she has done several times. Many of us are puzzled by her reluctance to summon the Israeli ambassador. That would seem like the first step that should have been taken. Yeah. But will the government now commit to supporting the ICC investigations into this incident, but also into the wider behaviour of the Israeli Defence Forces in the occupied territories? Here.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, not only have we worked with other members of the UN Security Council in strongly condemning this incident and needing to have the investigation I've mentioned, but we have also been very clear that we're very concerned about other incidents of Palestinian civilians being killed by Israeli security forces in recent weeks, and we continue to urge for thorough and transparent investigations of those killings as well.
Andy Slaughter.
Mr. Speaker. Another journalist is murdered in occupied Palestine. Next, the occupying power raids her family home, and then its forces brutally attack pallbearers and mourners at Shireen's funeral. In the light of that, the government's response has been pathetic and inadequate. The Minister won't even call for an independent, that is independent of the Israeli forces who have whitewashed previous deaths in this way. Will she do that? And will she just say this? What single step has the government taken, not said but done, to oppose the occupation of Palestine, which is at the root of this violence? Will they recognise Palestine? Will they ban trade with illegal settlements? Will they sign up to the ICC inquiry? Because if not, then her words are completely empty today.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I have said really clearly, we have led work at the UN to make sure that there is a joint statement, not just from us, but from the entire security. I am answering the question, sir. Please do not heckle me. Thank you. This is a tragic, tragic death, a really tragic death. And we have led the work at the United Nations to put the pressure on to make sure, to the best extent that we can, to make sure that this investigation happens, that it is fair, that it is transparent, and therefore, and the word that the UN has used, which I will repeat again because that's the word from that statement, is that it's impartial. We absolutely are very clear. He asked about the settlements. We are very clear. Settlements are illegal under international law. They call into question Israel's commitment to the two-state solution. We urge Israel to halt its settlement expansion. That threatens the viability of a Palestinian state, and we will continue always to press for peace.
Diane Abbott.
Does the Minister appreciate that everybody in this House regrets the killing of men and women in Israel, whether they are Israeli or whether they are Palestinians? And it is quite wrong to imply anything else. There has been talk of the necessity of establishing the facts. Does the Minister further appreciate that the facts of the terrible scenes at Shireen's funeral are beyond doubt? Millions of people around the world have seen those images. And finally, does the Minister understand that it's no use telling us that Shireen's death is a tragedy? We know that. We will only take her words seriously when she commits this afternoon in this House that she will indeed call the Israeli ambassador to the Foreign Office. Otherwise, her words are just words.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, she is absolutely right that all deaths in this situation are a total tragedy, that what happened at Shireen's funeral should not have happened. I cannot give her any more comments at this point. I've told her what we're doing, and I have told her that ministers always look at what further steps can be taken. Our fundamental priority here must be to continue to urge for a de-escalation of tensions, an end to violence, and the pathway to peace.
Mohammed Jassin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The murder of Shireen Abu Akleh and the attacks on mourners at her funeral has shocked the world. It's not enough to condemn the actions, but to take actions. So when will the UK government stop authorizing arms sales to Israel that we know are killing innocent Palestinians?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we take the export of arms extremely seriously, and as has been said many, many times in this House, the United Kingdom has one of the most robust arms export control regimes anywhere in the world. The important thing now is to call upon all parties, and I hope you would all agree with me, to call upon all parties to de-escalate the tensions and work towards peace.
Christian Matheson.
Mr. Speaker, in her initial statement and in subsequent answers, the Minister has referenced her attempts to get a statement at the United Nations. The problem is that Israel has consistently ignored any critical statements coming out of the UN and has even sought to undermine the legitimacy of the UN and other international institutions. So why does she think this time will be any different?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's really important that voices from all across the world have condemned this awful deed.
Baladir Adit.
Not the first time this has happened, and neither will it be the last. Under occupation, Palestinians' human rights are abused, and under occupation, as we've seen, they cannot even bury their dead with dignity. Does the Minister understand that until we have a lasting peace, we will not be tackling the solution at its very, very root? And does she understand that whilst the UK has committed to a two-state solution, you can't have two states if you only recognise one? So perhaps she would like to reconsider the answer that she gave to my honourable friend and tell us when exactly she's going to recognise the Palestinian state.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what is clear is that bilateral recognition by itself won't end the occupation. We need the parties to come to talks and work towards peace.
Nadia Whitty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh by the Israeli military and the subsequent attack on her funeral in Jerusalem demonstrated the realities of the occupation of the West Bank, which Amnesty International says constitutes apartheid as a crime against humanity, as defined in the Rome Statutes and Apartheid Convention. Will the Minister not only condemn this act of inhumanity, but also commit now to summoning the Israeli ambassador? Will she take steps to ensure that the UK ceases all arms trade with Israel and ensure that Britain is not complicit in the illegal occupation of Palestine?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've already stated many times the actions that we have taken, and that, of course, at all times ministers look at what further steps might be taken.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've had a great many letters from my constituents in Warwick and Leamington. I'm sure many others across this House have as well, since the brutal murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. They are saddened, they're sickened by the scenes of her funeral, what happened, and also they are deeply angry at the lack of reaction. So can I just say, will she confirm, I know she says impartial, but can she not just press the government to push for an independent investigation into the death? And can she place, please, on record before this House the dates of the meetings she's had with the Israeli ambassador and the agenda of those meetings, because we need to bring some sort of resolution and establish a two-state solution in that land.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the most important thing about this investigation is that it is for it to be accountable and for it to ensure accountability for those that carried out this act, so they can be held to account. And that is the most important part of this. That is why we've worked towards this wording to say it should be immediate, thorough, transparent, fair and impartial. But the most important thing is to get the accountability. I can't, from the dispatch box at this stage, tell you the meetings that I have had, as I am not the Minister for the Middle East, but I'm sure we can follow up with a member in writing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Surely this appalling desecration of the funeral of Shireen Abu Akleh is evidence, if any more were needed, of the crime of apartheid that is being inflicted upon the Palestinian people, and which has been rigorously documented by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International and the Israeli human rights organisation B'Tselem. Instead of passing laws to ban local authorities and civil society from taking action against this brutal occupation, isn't it time to accept the legal analysis of these human rights organisations and do the right and moral thing and impose sanctions in response to this appalling criminality?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, so I'm afraid I need to disagree with the honourable gentleman, because we don't believe that boycotts, divestments or sanctions would help to create an atmosphere that would be conducive to peace. I note the word that he used of apartheid. We don't use that terminology, and we don't agree with its use because it is a legal term, and therefore a judgment on whether or not you can use that term and needs to come under international law by a judicial decision, and it's really, really important because it is a legal term. And actually, one thing I do agree with him, though, is that civil society always plays an important part in a democracy.
Tim Bonner.
Mr. Speaker, the sad reality is that the horrific murder of Shireen is just another tragedy in 74 years of unaddressed ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And yet, rather than sanction Israel for this behaviour, 55 years after occupation began, the UK government is busy strengthening relations with new trade deals. So I will ask the Minister, for the first time, why won't she summon the Ambassador of Israel to the Foreign Office?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the most important thing that we need to do is try and work towards peace. And that is why we are working internationally, both for us to condemn this incident and internationally to condemn it. That is why we've called for this investigation. We want people to be held to account, and that is why we are working with our ambassadors and our British Council in Jerusalem, in Israel, to work to try and de-escalate tensions now, and that is the most important thing.
Ollie Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that Shireen was wearing a press vest and helmet, yet in addressing the circumstances of her murder, an Israeli military spokesperson said they're armed with cameras, if you will permit me to say so. Will the Minister be unequivocal in her support for journalists and transparency in Palestine and condemn any sense that to carry a camera is to be armed, reaffirming that respect for a free press should be fundamental in any state calling itself a democracy?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom stands on the side of journalists all across the world, wherever they are. Media freedom is a vital part of our democracy and of our freedom as individuals, and we stand for journalists.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I declare an interest as a member of the Friends of Israel group? I also thank the Minister for her response. But can I, having seen innocent bystanders killed on numerous occasions in Northern Ireland, with similarities, as the Minister will know, being drawn between Nira McKee, who was killed by the new IRA as a journalist reporting on the unrest in 2019, and the victim in this case, Shireen Abu Akleh. Does the Minister not agree that the loss of life is truly tragic, and that all steps must be taken to ensure the safety of those who seek to report the news from an unbiased position? And what steps does the Minister feel her department can take to internationally send that message? Thank you.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we absolutely continue to call out attacks against journalists and media internationally, and he's also right to point out that attacks against journalists have happened in the United Kingdom in our history, and I remember that tragedy well. We are one of the leading countries in the world standing for media freedom. We founded the Media Freedom Coalition. It now has 52 members, and we'd like to see more.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I send my condolences to the family and colleagues of Shireen Abu Akleh. Can the Minister affirm that, contrary to the statement of the Israeli military spokesperson, just because a journalist is armed with a camera doesn't make them a target?
Journalists should never be targets.
Right, that completes the urgent question. Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On 27th of April, I raised the issue of the Prime Minister's comments about increased employment since the pandemic. After that, I wrote to the UK Statistics Authority over the issue, and in its reply on the 11th of May, the authority's interim chair said that the Prime Minister needed to be more clear about employment statistics and that he was running the risk of a misleading impression of trends in the labour market being given. The UK Statistics Authority has also contacted the 10 Downing Street briefing team on numerous occasions in the past few months on this matter, and yet the Prime Minister has continued to reiterate the claim. Could I ask Mr. Speaker's advice over what a Minister should do if they use statistics in a way that, that they then find could inadvertently mislead the House, and what action is open to this House to ensure that that is followed?
Can I first of all thank the Honourable Lady for giving notice of a point of order, which will have been heard by the Government front bench. As the Deputy Speaker said on the 27th of April, it's important for information given to the House to be accurate, and that, if necessary, then matters should be addressed appropriately and action taken to correct the record. If she continues to be dissatisfied, the Table Office can advise her on ways in which to take the matter further. Leila Moran, point of order.
point of order, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to seek your guidance. Today, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office released their long-awaited international development strategy. Now, this is the most significant change in policy for the UK government development since the announcement of the aid cut in November 2020. And indeed, according to the strategy itself, it says the government's vision for the future of the UK development is at the heart of UK foreign policy. Their words, not mine. So to that end, I was very disappointed that the strategy was released as a written statement, rather than the Foreign Secretary coming to this House and answering questions by members. We spend a significant sum of money on official development assistance every year, and considering that the strategy also continues to be highly evasive in what I would consider a very concerning way on when the 0.7% of GNI target will be restored, it deserves proper debate. Mr. Speaker, can you advise me how can we get the Foreign Secretary to come to this House and answer questions?
Well, I thank the honourable member for giving notice of the point of order. I have received no notice from ministers that they intend to make a statement on this matter, although the international development strategy has been laid today, as correctly says. This House knows that I have no power to compel a minister to make a statement. Ministers on the front bench will have, however, heard the honourable member's point of order. The honourable member is, of course, free to pursue this matter through other means, and I am sure she knows which routes to take. Jim Shannon, point of order.
Mr. Speaker, this morning, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was visiting Northern Ireland to ascertain from all the parties the position in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It has, or have you, Mr. Speaker, been notified of the Prime Minister to come to this House to make a statement on those talks and those discussions, to make sure that the Northern Ireland Protocol, of course, is ditch number one, just to know exactly what government's intentions are in this matter? Thank you.
Good point, Jim.
I can honestly say that nobody's been to say that they wish to come to this House, neither the Prime Minister nor anybody representing the government. So I'm sure through your good offices you won't leave it at that. I'm sure that you will pursue it, and your colleagues from Northern Ireland will do the same. No further points of order. We now move on. Thanks, Rosa.
The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Queen's Speech. Motion for an address. Adjourned debate on question.
You have to say now. The question is that an humble address be presented to Her Majesty as on the order paper. I call Secretary Nadeem Zahawi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is a great honour for me to open this debate on the Loyal Address. In Her Majesty's Jubilee year, I want to thank her for her dedication and service to our country, the Commonwealth and all its people. This includes young immigrants arriving on these shores who feel her warmth and generosity, and of course some of them who end up as her ministers. I also want to thank Prince Charles and Prince William, the Duke of Cambridge, for opening Parliament on her behalf. During Her Majesty's 70-year reign, this country has been the best place in the world to grow up and grow old. Yet, during these 7 decades, Madam Deputy Speaker, the British people have overcome major challenges time and time again. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have now just lived through what I'm sure you will agree has been an incredibly difficult period. After years of sacrifice by people up and down the country, this Queen's Speech focuses our attention exactly where it should be: the future. The future, full of promise, will again not be without its challenges, both at home and, of course, overseas. Our country needed a Queen's Speech that rises to the scale of the challenge we face, and we have delivered it. Our communities needed a Queen's Speech that keeps them safe, secure and prosperous, and we will deliver it. And, of course, our constituents needed a Queen's Speech that shows them the door of opportunity is always open to them, and we will deliver it. Our relentless focus, Madam Deputy, is delivery, delivery, delivery. Before I outline how our legislative programme is making sure that this country remains the best place to grow up and grow old, I would just like to reaffirm this government's solidarity with the people of Ukraine. I'm pleased to say that all Ukrainian children and young people arriving in the United Kingdom have the right to access state education whilst in the UK. With memories of my own childhood, Madam Deputy Speaker, leaving Saddam Hussein's Iraq and building a new life here, I know how important education is to helping young people integrate into their new communities. But not only do we... I'll give way to the Honourable.
Thank the Secretary of State for that, and he's absolutely right to say that there's no better place in the world to live other than this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, always better together. But just to say this to the Minister, the Secretary of State, can he confirm, when it comes to education, through the government policies and the Queen's speech, that every step will be taken to ensure that every child in this United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will achieve their academic success, that every person who is on the waiting list for health will have a better health system, and every elderly person who's dependent on a better income for energy, food and heat, those things would also be part of the Queen's speech. Thank you.
I'm grateful to the member for Strangford, and I think he speaks for the whole of Northern Ireland when he says the focus has to be on education and healthcare and those public services that the people of Northern Ireland so badly need to be delivered upon. But not only do we need to make sure, Madam Speaker, that Ukrainian refugees are well integrated, we need to give them the same skills that we are giving our children so that they can take on the challenges of the future. And I just want to take this opportunity to commend schools and local authorities across England for rising to that challenge of welcoming and supporting children arriving from Ukraine and offering thousands of them a school place. In these same schools, Madam Deputy Speaker, that are at the heart of our plans to level up. One of the first bills introduced this session in the other place is the Schools Bill, delivering a stronger school system that works for every child, no matter where they were born or live in our country. It will work alongside close to £5 billion of investment for our ambitious multi-year education recovery plan, investing in what we know works: teacher training, tutoring and extra educational opportunities, including, of course, extra hours for those who've got least time left in education, the 16 to 19-year-old students. Madam Deputy Speaker, the evidence is clear that our plan is working and the recovery is happening. Primary pupils recovering around 0.1 months in reading and 0.9 months in maths since the summer. Combined with our £7 billion cash increase in the total core schools budget by 2024-25, not 10 years ago, but compared to 21-22, we are giving schools the resources they need to focus on student outcomes. It is money that will help schools increase teachers' pay, including delivering on our manifesto pledge of £30,000 starting salary. Money that will help schools deliver resources for students and money that will help schools meet inflationary pressures in these uncertain times. But there is more to do, Madam Deputy Speaker, because as it stands today, too many children leave primary school unable to meet the expected standards in reading, writing and mathematics, despite the remarkable progress in the last decade. Through our bill, by 2030, 90% of primary school children will achieve the expected standard in reading, writing and maths, and the percentage of children meeting the expected standard in the worst performing areas which need the most help will have increased by over a third. To meet our ambitious targets, the Schools Bill will go further, taking steps to make children safe, addressing standards in attendance, all underpinned by a fairer and stronger school system. And because our best multi-academy trusts, that family of schools delivering improvement in schools and in areas where poor performance had become entrenched, by 2030 we want all schools either in a strong multi-academy trust or with plans to join or form one. Madam Deputy Speaker, our ambitions are... I will be brief.
I thank the Secretary of State for his allowing me to intervene. He's making a very powerful point. Is he aware that in my area, the strong Odyssey Trust, which runs the successful Townley Girls Grammar School, is already ahead of the game on this one and has taken over the failing Erith School and made it King Henry School, and are determined to make it a great success?
I'm grateful for my honourable friend. I certainly am aware of the Odyssey Trust, and indeed it is exactly that passion for transforming young people's lives that we need them on this journey, and I know they and many other grammar schools, I think 90 of the 165 grammar schools have already joined those families of schools, will do the same. Madam Deputy Speaker, our ambitions are for all children, including those with special educational needs and disabilities who may need additional support to reach their potential. The SEND and Alternative Provision Green Paper published in March sets out our ambitions for children and young people with SEND. Our proposals will build a more inclusive and financially sustainable system that delivers the right support in the right place at the right time for every child and young person. And we want to establish a new single national SEND and alternative provision system, and are investing now to secure the future sustainability for that system. We have also set out clear roles and responsibilities and, of course, accountability measures for everybody working in the SEND and alternative provision sector. This includes the new national and local inclusion dashboards to give a timely and, I think, transparent picture of how the system is performing across education, health and care, which is what parents have asked us to do. Madam Deputy Speaker, children and young people are the future of our country, but they cannot succeed if they are not safe and secure at home. That is why, under my stewardship, the Department for Education has been laser-focused on families. With strong families, we can make a fairer society, one in which children can escape the quicksand of disadvantage. With strong families, we help make sure that every child can grow up happy and, of course, with that vital opportunity. And we are taking steps to strengthen families. We're funding 75 local authorities, half of England's local authorities, with the highest levels of child deprivation, to create family hubs and transform that support for families. Our investment includes a focus on babies, children and families in the early years, with funding for breastfeeding, parenting and parent-infant mental health services. Where families need more help, we've expanded the Supporting Families programme so that up to 300,000 families with more complex needs can work with a key worker to help resolve problems. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Safety is at the heart of so many parents when they send their child into settings, and I welcome the family hub. Last week, a child died in a nursery in my constituency. I send my heartfelt condolences to the family. It was a heartbreaking time. 10 years ago, another constituent lost her child in a nursery. She's Dan and John Thompson. They set up in Millie's name, the child's Millie's Trust, and now have Millie's Mark, which accredits people in nurseries, staff in nurseries, who have got paediatric first aid training. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that safety in nurseries and childcare settings is vitally important, that paediatric first aid is vitally important for members of staff to know how to deal with these emergencies? And would you join me in calling for it to be widespread?
There are a lot of speakers trying to get into this debate, really a lot. So interventions do need to be really very brief. Thank you. Secretary of State.
I'm grateful for my honourable friend. I absolutely agree with her on Millie's Mark. And of course, child safety in nurseries is vital and non-negotiable. And I'm very grateful for her for bringing the accreditation to the House's attention. And of course, as I was saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, where families do need that additional help, we've expanded Supporting Families programme so that those 300,000 families with more complex needs can work with a key worker to help resolve problems. And of course, to improve the lives and outcomes, I'll just make a little bit more headway. I will take her intervention with pleasure. To improve the lives and outcomes of children with a social worker, we need to make some fundamental changes to the current system. I look forward to seeing the recommendations from the independent review of children's social care, which will be published in the coming weeks, the McAllister Review. It is a once-in-a-generation opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to improve outcomes for children and families. This government is also acutely aware of how important childcare is to both children and their mums and dads. In each of the past 3 years, we have spent in excess of £3.5 billion a year on our early education entitlements, and we will continue to support families with their childcare costs. And at the spending review last October, we announced additional funding for the early years entitlements worth £160 million in 22-23, £180 million in 23-24, £170 million in 24-25, compared to 21-22 financial year. Providing quality childcare is vital for children to develop from the earliest opportunity. But there is another point to all of this, Madam Deputy Speaker. We know that women are most likely to shoulder high childcare costs. The aim of the government's universal credit childcare offer is to support parents for whom paid childcare is a barrier to work, to overcome that barrier. This works alongside the tax-free childcare, helping parents return to work and making sure it pays to work. For every £8 parents pay into their childcare account, we add £2, up to a maximum of £2,000 in top-up per year for each child up to the age of 11, and up to £4,000 per disabled child until they are 17. Overall, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has spent over £4 billion each year for the past 5 years on childcare in the United Kingdom through childcare offers led by my department, the Department of Education, and of course tax-free childcare and the employer support childcare. Addressing this issue means women can, if they wish, go back to their careers. It is fair to them and it is good for business and the economy. Madam Deputy Speaker, for our long-term economic success will really turn on our ability to nurture and utilise talent, including new mothers. Human potential, human capital is the most important resource on earth. To steal a phrase from my right honourable friend, the chair of the Education Select Committee, we are determined to build a skills-rich economy. We are committed to delivering those skills through massive investment and reforms to skills and further education provision. We've already embarked on revolutionising the post-16 education sector, transforming apprenticeships, driving up quality, better meeting the skills needs of employers through more flexible training models. We've launched T-levels, boosting access to high-quality technical education for thousands of young people and, of course, creating our skilled workforce of the future. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will pledge to the House to make T-levels as famous as A-levels. Watch this space. In the last parliamentary session, we successfully passed the Skills and Post-16 Education Act to do just this. This Act, alongside our wider reforms, including an additional £3.8 billion investment in skills over this Parliament, rightly in my view, places employers at the heart of the skills system, supporting our ambition for everyone to be able to access the training they need to move into highly skilled jobs. There is, of course, a crucial role for our universities in making sure that our country remains the best place to grow up and, given the link to future earnings and opportunities, to grow old too. We will bring forward further legislation through a higher education reform bill to ensure that our post-18 education system promotes real social mobility, is financially sustainable and will support people to get the skills they need to meet their career aspirations and help grow the economy. Alongside this, I'll give way to one minute.
Thank the Secretary of State for what he's saying, but will, in the bill he's bringing forward, will he address the injustice that Muslim students face, because at the moment they cannot access student loans, and Islamic suitable loans were promised by David Cameron in 2014, and they are still waiting. Will he address this?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I made that pledge to the Education Select Committee when I went before them a few weeks ago. We are looking at how we deliver against that. And as I was saying, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will bring forward further legislation through the Higher Education Reform Bill to ensure that our post-18 education system does promote real social mobility, including the point the Honourable Lady quite rightly raises, and is financially sustainable. Now, alongside this, we are meeting our manifesto commitment to challenge any restriction of lawful speech and academic freedom. The Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill will strengthen existing freedoms of speech duties and will directly address gaps within the existing law, including the lack of a clear enforcement mechanism. Madam Speaker, for both universities and technical education, one of the most important policies we're implementing as part of the Skills and Post-16 Education Act is the paradigm-shifting lifelong loan entitlement. A new and flexible skills system, it will provide people with an entitlement equivalent to 4 years of post-18 education to use over their lifetime in modules or as a whole, worth £37,000 in today's money. We are writing a new chapter. No, Madam Speaker, I think we're writing a new book in skills education. This will give people the ability to train, retrain and upskill in response to changing skills needs and employment patterns. In a dynamic economy, colleagues, where sectors can be crushed and reborn in double time, this has to be our priority. The world is different now to when I entered the world of work and business, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is different now than when I became an MP 12 years ago. We must not just keep up with a changing world, we must lead the change. This Queen's speech lays out how we will do this. As I said at the start of my statement, I'm focused on delivering against the ambitious targets we have set ourselves across skills, schools and families, and holding ourselves to account against those. I believe sharing our plans and performance data is a key lever to drive rapid improvement through the complex systems we oversee. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. He talks about skills, so important. Would he recognise the real crisis we face when it comes to skills in the health service, in particular the number of people we lack in prevention and treatment of cancer? Would he look at, and would the Secretary of State for Health, his friend sat next to him, look at the amendment in my name on the order paper, which calls for a strategy to tackle the cancer backlog, in particular the fact that over a third of my constituents with cancer are waiting more than 2 months for their first treatment?
I'm grateful for the Right Honourable Member's intervention, and I think a couple of things to say on that. One, obviously, I know that the Secretary for Health will address this, but his priority, his laser-like focus is on the backlog and dealing with that backlog, but also the investment in Cumbria and the University of Cumbria in terms of those clinical training and needs that is happening for his constituents as well. As I said, Madam Speaker, at the start of my statement, I am focused on that delivery, and I'm passionate in believing that the performance data is key as a lever to drive rapid improvement through a complex system in education or in health, and that transparency, as we did with vaccine, we will do again in education and health. And I've committed to publishing a delivery plan setting out what we will achieve and a performance dashboard showing progress so the House and the country can hold us to account. I've already written to all schools stating that we will publish data on uptake of the National Tutoring Programme this summer. Many schools have helpfully given us access to their attendance data, and I'm conducting a trial over the coming weeks to share that data back in a way I think that prompts helpful actions in schools and, of course, in local authorities. Madam Deputy Speaker, the spirit with which our education sector responded to the pandemic demonstrated why this is the best country to grow up in. It is a spirit I will give way to Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. And when he's talking about the best place for young people to grow up in, could he explain to me why there isn't a single placement of special provision for children at risk across the country, as my constituent is experiencing right now?
I'm grateful for the Honourable Lady. She raises a very important point, partly why the McAllister Review is so important into children's social care, and I'll be saying more on that in the coming weeks. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I was just praising the incredible spirit of our education front line, those brilliant teachers, school leaders, and of course support staff, never forget the support staff, demonstrates why this is the best country to grow up in. It is a spirit we see across our public and private sector, including, of course, the National Health Service, working with our great vaccine companies, which has led the way in protecting lives and livelihoods in the battle against COVID. Thanks to the astonishing rollout of the vaccine and booster programmes, we were the first European nation to protect half of our population with at least one dose, and the first major European nation to boost, thanks to my right honourable friend, half of our population too. Following the unprecedented challenges placed on the NHS by COVID, we will spend more than £8 billion from 22-23 to 24-25, supported by the revenue from the Health and Social Care Levy to clear the COVID elective backlogs. But we must be honest. We must be honest, Madam Speaker. Our NHS faces long-term challenges too, including an ageing population and people increasingly living with multiple long-term conditions. At this critical moment, we must now seize the opportunity to put our healthcare system on a more sustainable path for the future, whilst meeting the immediate, urgent recovery challenges we face. The Health and Care Bill has created the structures for this sustainable future. At the same time, as my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, will outline later, we will publish draft legislation to reform the Mental Health Act so patients suffering from mental health conditions have greater control over their treatment and receive the dignity and respect that they deserve. I know the NHS is an institution that makes people proud to be British. I share this, I would say this entire government shares this sentiment, and that is why we are safeguarding its sustainable future. Madam Deputy Speaker, in closing, this was a Queen's speech filled with substantial policies, not least those that give young people the education they need to succeed in life. Policies that will provide more rungs on the ladder of opportunity, and opportunity for older people who want a chance to learn and retrain. Policies that put skills at the heart of our economy to unleash its potential. Policies that back our public services so they can deliver what our country needs. Policies that sustain the truth that this is the best place in the world to grow up and grow old in. Thank you, Madam President.
Order. Before I call the Shadow Secretary of State, it will be obvious that there are a large number of speakers wishing to participate in this debate. And I won't put a time limit on to start with, but I will be expecting that speakers will be maximum 5 minutes. Shadow Secretary of State Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak in today's debate on behalf of the opposition and to set out the contrast between a Conservative government which has spent 12 long years failing Britain and a Labour Party determined to make our country the best place to grow up and the best place to grow old. As the Leader of the Opposition set out last week, at the heart of the government's programme, there is a poverty of ambition for our public services, entirely inadequate for the challenges we face. We see that in the ongoing refusal by the government to commit to a children's recovery plan to support children after the disruption of the pandemic on anything like the scale which either their adviser, Sir Kevin Collins, or the Labour Party has set out. Now, I remain disappointed but sadly not surprised. This is, after all, the government that reopened the pubs before it reopened schools. 12 years in, and the Conservatives are out of ideas, out of touch and out of steam. The challenges we face as a country demand vision, leadership, energy, drive, determination. Of course there are challenges which every country faces, and there are the challenges bequeathed by the pandemic and its legacy. But there are also the challenges brought to us by 12 years of Conservative failure, and what they all have in common is that every single one of them is a challenge from which this government flinches. A generation of children has been through the education system in this country under Conservative governments since 2010. Their experience is the core narrative of this government's failure. Not simply a failure to deliver, but a failure to think, a failure to plan, a failure to resource and a failure to learn. I think of what a child starting school in 2010 would have seen in that time. Real terms cuts to funding per pupil. Secondary school classes at their largest for a generation. Hundreds of thousands more children eligible for free school meals. School buildings repaired, cancelled, postponed. Hundreds of days lost to the pandemic. Botched examinations, not for 1 year, but 2. And now this historic failure to invest in the children's recovery plan that the government's own expert recommended and which our children desperately need. Madam Deputy Speaker, the only thing on the up under this government is child poverty. And now, as that child, that young person, looks ahead to university and the years that follow, they can see higher costs than ever before, stretching almost to retirement. Yes, I give way.
Comparisons of what it was like going to school under a Conservative government. I went to school under a Labour government. I left my secondary school in 2005, which had an 11% pass rate. 1 in 3 teachers were supply teachers. Wasn't that real legacy of a Labour government, of a failed generation?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the last Labour government transformed the life chances of children right across our country. Child poverty down, investment in our schools, schools rebuilt, teachers properly supported. That is a record of which we are very proud. This is a generation of children, Madam Deputy Speaker, let down from primary school right the way through to university. A generation of children failed by the Conservatives. And I can tell you why they've been failed. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has stopped thinking in terms of children, people, parents and families. Too long in power, they are mistaking changing institutions and changing regulations for improving the lives of our people. Just look at the schools bill published last week. I genuinely hoped for better. But what do we find? Narrow in scope, hollow in ambition, thin on policy. 32 clauses on the governance of academies. 15 on funding arrangements. And on funding, what a sorry sight it is to see a Conservative Chancellor and a Conservative Secretary of State seeking plaudits merely for aiming to restore, by 2024, a level of real terms school funding achieved by the last Labour government, when his own government has spent a decade slicing it away. And the newspapers this weekend sadly made too clear that whichever children the Secretary of State cares about, it doesn't appear that it's always the children in England's state schools. We learned that he is concerned that the success of our young people in accessing their first choice universities from England's state schools, the schools which the vast majority of children attend, the schools for which he is primarily responsible, is evidence, in his words, of tilting the system away from private schools, of which he tells us he is so proud. tilting the system. What an extraordinary remark by the Secretary of State for Education about the success of students in state schools in our country. Yeah. But if that were not enough, the next day brought further clarification. Not only does he appear concerned by the growing success of state-educated children in entering their universities of first choice, apparently he doesn't even appear bothered that their schools are crumbling around them. Let me quote his own officials within the last 2 months, and I quote, "Some sites are risk to life, too many costly and energy inefficient repairs rather than rebuilds, and rebuild demand 3 times supply. Some sites are risk to life. Children are being educated in schools which are a risk to life, and his government hasn't lifted a finger." Madam Deputy Speaker, the children of this country are being failed by an Education Secretary more interested in appealing to Conservative Party members than in ensuring the success of our young people. I'll happily give way.
The lady's made 2 points in the last 2 minutes, one about school funding for buildings and the second about children for private schools. Perhaps I could, with the Deputy Speaker's permission, test both. One, will she welcome the over £1 million given to Carr's Grammar School in Sleaford to improve the school building and facilities? And secondly, I went to a comprehensive school in Middlesbrough until I was 16. Just before I was 16, I met somebody out when I was out on a walk in the hills who went to Gordonston, a brilliant public school. They gave